The bridge at Widow's Crossing was a low concrete deck over a creek that ran fast in March and barely moved by August, and Caleb Sutton had driven across it maybe 4,000 times in his life without once looking at the water. That night he stopped on it. He stopped because the headlights showed in the guardrail on the downstream side bent outward in a way it had not been bented for that afternoon, and because a man who has poured concrete and welded rail for 22 years can tell the difference between rust failure and force. The rail had been pushed from the inside, not hit by a truck, pushed the way a fence post leans when something heavy leans on it and then decides to leave. He sat there with the engine running and the wipers off, and the creek going under him in the dark, and he did the thing he always did, which was to stack the facts before he let himself feel anything about them. The rail was galvanized 2-inch pipe, set in 8 inches of cured deck. He'd set it himself the summer his daughter was born. To bend it outward, you needed leverage from the creek side, from below the deck line, from a place a person could not stand. He turned that over twice and set it down. He thought about a come-along, a chain, a winch on a truck back to the rail, and he discarded each of them because there was no purchase down there, no anchor, no flat ground, only the riprap dropping away to the water, and a machine big enough to do it would have left its own marks. The rational answer tried and failed in the time it took him to think it. Then he put the truck in gear and finished the crossing slower than he meant to. And he did not look at the water because the water was not where the wrongness was. Caleb ran the county's small bridge and culvert crew out of a yard off the picket line, 3 men and a boom truck and a welding rig, and the work was honest and the pay was thin, and he had never wanted anything else. He was 46. He had a wife named Risa, who taught 4th grade, and a daughter named Wren, who was 11 months old, and slept in a crib against the east wall of a bedroom that had been a sewing room until the previous spring. They lived in a brick ranch a 1/4 mile up the grade from the crossing, the last house, on a road that the county had stopped salting in winter because there was no one past them to salt for. He liked that. He had chosen it. He had walked the property line the week they signed, and noted where the woods came close to the house and where they held back, and he kept the brush cut to 100 feet on the bedroom side because a man who reads the land for a living does not let the land crowd his sleep. He did not exaggerate. His crew teased him for it. When a culvert was rated for a 40-year flood, he said 40-year flood, not biblical. When a man asked how cold it got up the grade, he gave the number off the porch thermometer and nothing more. He kept a carpenter pencil behind his right ear and a steel tape on his belt and a small spiral pad in his shirt pocket. And when something on a job did not add up, he wrote the numbers down before he let himself have an opinion about them, because numbers held still and opinions did not. His morning was the same. Every morning, coffee in the dented thermos, the lid screwed down hard so it would not leak on the seat, boots laced sitting on the tailgate. A slow first drive across Widow's Crossing, with the window down to listen to the water, which told him in 2 seconds what the gauge would have told him in 2 minutes. He had read that creek for years, the way other men read a newspaper, and it had never once lied to him, and that was part of why the bent rail sat in him the way it did. So when he told Risa that night that the downstream rail at the crossing had been bent and he did not know by what, he said exactly that and not one word past it. And she looked up from the bottle she was warming and read his face the way wives do and decided correctly. She had married a man who did not bring trouble into the kitchen, unless the trouble was real and the not saying was the loudest thing he could have done. She set the bottle down on a folded dish towel and waited. "Could have been the high water last week," she said. It was a kindness, not a theory. She knew the high water had come and gone. Water doesn't push a rail outward, Caleb said. Water pushes downstream. This went the other way. She didn't answer that. She tested the bottle on her wrist and carried it down the hall, and he heard the small sounds of Wren waking and settling, and he stood in the kitchen a while longer with his coffee going cold, and listened to the dark outside the window over the sink. And it was then that he noticed the first thing he could not stack into a fact. The spring peepers had been loud at the creek all month, loud enough that you stopped hearing them the way you stop hearing a refrigerator. They were not going now. The window was open 2 inches at the bottom, and the night past the screen was as quiet as a held breath, and the silence bothered him before anything else did. He told himself, frogs go quiet. A heron in the shallows, an owl on the wire, a coon working the bank. Any of it would shut the peepers up for an hour. He told himself that, and he half believed it, and he closed the window and went to bed, and in the morning the rail was still bent and the peepers were back and the world had the ordinary look of a world that owes you no explanations. The next day, he brought the boom truck down and looked at the rail in daylight. In daylight, it was worse. The pipe had not simply leaned. It had been drawn outward 6 or 7 inches at the midspan, and the deck around its base showed 2 gouges in the concrete parallel, 4 inches apart, deep enough to catch a fingernail. He photographed them with his phone and hated, the way he always hated, how the phone made the gouges look small and harmless, 2 scratches on gray, concrete nothing. He laid his tape across them. 4 1/4 inches outside to outside. He wrote that on the back of a delivery ticket in carpenter pencil, because pattern kept you alive, and numbers were how you held a pattern still. He measured the height of the bend off the deck. He measured the throat of the bent pipe where the wall of it had buckled. He ran his hand along the inside curve of the bend, where the galvanized had cracked and flaked, and the metal there was bright, fresh torn, not weathered, which meant the bend was new. His foreman, a steady older man named Del Pruitt, who had set rail in 3 counties and did not spook, crouched beside the gouges and looked at them a long time. Del ran his thumb along one groove and then the other, and did not say anything clever. Something got a hold of it, he said finally. I don't know what gets a hold of 2-inch galvanized and wins. He stood up with his knees popping and looked at the woods on the creek side. The way a man looks at a tree line when he is deciding whether to say the next thing. He didn't say it. What he said instead was that he'd seen a bull walk through a cattle gate once like it was made of string, and that a flood could roll a culvert section the size of a car. That there was strong and then there was strong, and Caleb let him talk because he could hear Del talking himself toward the comfortable side of it and did not have the heart to stop him. Then Del looked at the gouges again, and the comfort went out of his voice. He told Caleb the county would want the rail replaced before somebody's grandkid leaned on it, and that was true and useful, and they left it there. Caleb noticed, though, that Del did not walk down the bank to look at the creek side of the deck, and that on the drive back to the yard Del kept his eyes out the passenger window at the tree line the whole way, and said nothing at all. They replaced the rail on a Thursday. Caleb welded the new pipe himself, ground the weld smooth, painted the galvanized where the grind had cut it. Good work. He left the crossing the way he left every job, quieter and squarer than he found it, and he drove up the grade to his house, feeling the small, clean satisfaction of a thing fixed. That feeling lasted until he turned into his own drive and saw the dog. They had a dog, an 8-year-old shepherd mix named Boone, who had never in his life been afraid of anything smaller than the propane truck. Boone treed coons for sport and met the propane truck at the road, every delivery with his hackles up and his pride intact. And he slept on the porch in all weather because he had decided the porch was his post, and a dog like that does not abandon a post. Boone was on the porch now, flat to the boards, pressed into the corner where the railing met the house wall. And he did not come down the steps to meet the truck. His ears were back. His weight was low. He was looking past Caleb, past the truck, down the grade toward the crossing and the woods, and the white showed all the way around his eyes. Caleb crouched and put a hand on him, and the dog was trembling. In a fine, continuous way. Not cold, not hurt, just locked onto something down the slope that Caleb turned and looked for and could not find. The road ran to the bridge. The woods stood the way woods stand. There was nothing there. The dog kept looking at the nothing. When Caleb tried to lead him down the steps by the collar, Boone set all 4 feet and would not move, and a low sound came out of him that Caleb had never heard from him. Not a bark, not a growl exactly. Something thinner and older. And Caleb let go of the collar. Inside, Risa said Boone had been like that since mid-afternoon, that he'd refused to go out past the porch, that he'd wet the boards rather than walk to the yard, which he had not done since he was a pup. She said it lightly because Wren was on her hip, and you keep your voice easy with a baby on your hip. But her eyes asked Caleb to make it ordinary, and he could not. So he said he'd keep an eye on it, and went out and walked the property line in the last hour of light with a flashlight he didn't need yet. Wren had been fussy all afternoon, too. Risa said to his back as he went, not sick, just clinging, wanting to be held at the window, and then crying at the window, and Caleb stopped on the step at that and did not turn around. The 100-foot cut on the bedroom side was clean. He walked it slow, the way he walked a job before he priced it, reading the ground. The mower lines were where he'd left them Sunday. The brush pile was undisturbed. At the far corner, where the mowed ground met the salal and the young poplar, he found where the deer trail came through. And he found the deer trail wrong. Deer had used that cut for years. A clean, narrow path worn to dirt. And the path simply stopped. Not petered out. Stopped the way a sentence stops at a period, at a point 10 feet inside the tree line. And past that point, the deer had not gone, or had gone around, or had gone somewhere a man tracking them in failing light. He crouched at the end of the path and looked at the last clear track in it, a doe's. The toe of it driven deep the way a track drives when a deer leaves its speed, and beyond it the leaf litter was scuffed and torn in a wide arc, as though the whole herd had wheeled in one motion. He stood at the end of the deer trail and felt the 100 feet of cut grass behind him as a thing too small, and he went back to the house and locked the doors he did not usually lock, and did not tell Risa why. That night the peepers quit at 9:40. He marked the clock, because he had decided to mark the clock. They quit all at once, not the ragged falling off of frogs settling for the night, but a clean cut, the whole creek going silent inside the space of a breath, and a minute after that Boone, shut in the mudroom because he would not settle anywhere else, began to growl from the back of his throat at the mudroom door, low and steady. The growl of a dog that has made up its mind. Caleb stood in the dark kitchen with the lights off so he could see the yard and saw the yard and nothing in it. The motion light over the carport had not tripped. He waited for it to trip. It did not trip. And then, at the edge of the carport light's reach, at the place where the cut grass went silver and the woods went black, something moved that did not trip the light, and the not tripping was worse than a shape would have been, because the light tripped for cats. He did not wake Risa. He sat at the kitchen table with the deer rifle across his knees, the rifle he used for the doe tag in November and had never once thought of as a thing that might not be enough, and he watched the yard until the peepers came back at 4:10 and the dark thinned to gray and the morning arrived and proved nothing at all. He had loaded it sitting there in the dark by feel 5 rounds and set the box beside his hand on the table, and the small click of the bolt had seemed loud and then foolish, because he had no clear idea what he would aim at or whether 5 rounds meant anything to a thing that bent 2-inch pipe. He had seen no shape he could swear to. He had a stopped deer trail and a silent hour and a dog that had wet the porch. He had a bent rail he had already replaced, so that even the rail was gone now, fixed, erased. He understood that he was assembling a case no one would believe, least of all the part of himself that had spent 46 years, trusting only what he could measure. He called the county dispatch that morning, not because he expected anything, but because a man builds a record. He told the woman on the line that he'd had a possible trespasser on his property up the picket grade, that his dog was disturbed, that he wanted it noted. She was kind and bored and asked if anything had been taken or damaged, and he said no, and she said she'd log it and a deputy would come by when one was free, and they both knew that meant no one was coming. He thanked her. Fear prefers one enemy to 10 unknowns, and a trespasser was one enemy, a man he could meet at the property line and turn around, and he wanted that to be the answer so badly that he let himself hold it most of the morning until lunch, when he drove down to the crossing to check his welds and found the print. It was in the soft ground of the creek bank, downstream of the deck, in the place a man could not stand. The creek had dropped in the dry week and left a margin of gray mud, and in the mud was a single clear impression and the partials of others, and Caleb went down the bank on his heels with one hand on the riprap and crouched over it and did not touch it for a long moment. It was not a bear. He had seen bear sign his whole life, and this was not it. It was longer than it was wide, and it carried weight on the front of it, on what would be the ball of a foot if it were a foot, and at the front of the impression were 4 points spaced wide and driven deep, deeper than the rest of the print, the way claws drive when a thing is pushing off. He laid his tape across it. The impression measured 11 inches heel to claw. The 4 points at the front spanned 4 1/4 inches, outside to outside, and he sat back on the riprap and did not move for a while, because 4 1/4 inches was the number on the back of the delivery ticket in his shirt pocket, the spacing of the gouges, and the rational explanation tried and discarded itself in the same breath that offered it. He photographed the print with a quarter laid beside it for scale. He photographed the partials. He cut a willow stick and stood it at the heel of the clear print and measured to the next clear partial, and got a stride of 51 inches, which was not a thing he could make sense of, and so he wrote it down without making sense of it. He thought, crouched there on the riprap, of every track he had ever read. A bear walked flat and wide and left claw marks short of the toe pad. A big cat pulled its claws and left no claw at all. A man left a heel. This left none of those. It carried its weight forward on the long ball of it, and the 4 points drove in ahead and deep. And there was no heel strike behind, the way a thing steps that is built to run on the front of its feet. He turned that over and could not set it down. And so he stopped turning it over and went back to measuring, because measuring did not ask him to believe anything. He bagged a tuft of coarse hair caught on the bent end of the old guardrail he had cut off and thrown in the truck bed. Hair he had not seen when he cut it, dark and stiff and longer than a deer's and not a deer's. And he sealed the bag and labeled it in carpenter pencil with the date, and did not let himself wonder what lab a county bridge welder sends hair to. He held the bag up to the light, and the hairs were banded dark at the root and paler toward the tip, with a coarse outer guard hair longer than the rest, and he had skinned enough game to know what guard hair was. He did the work of cataloging, because the work was the only ground he had left to stand on. He treated the crossing like a scene, because treating it like a scene kept his hands busy and his mind from the thing the evidence was beginning to say. That afternoon, he drove out to see an old man named Asa Tile, who had logged the picket country 40 years and trapped it longer, and was the one man Caleb knew who would neither laugh nor embroider. Asa was on his porch, shelling beans into a dishpan. Caleb showed him the photos on the phone, and Asa scrolled through them slowly with a thumb that had lost its nail to a chain years back. And he stopped on the print and looked at it, and his face did a thing Caleb had never seen it do, which was nothing at all, a deliberate held nothing, the face of a man choosing not to react. Where, Asa said, creek bank under Widow's Crossing. Downstream. Asa nodded slowly and handed the phone back and shelled a few more beans, and the silence went on long enough that Caleb understood it was an answer. My daddy pulled his line off the picket bottoms in 51, Asa said at last. Pulled it in the fall, and never said it again, and never said why. And he wasn't a man that quit ground. He looked at Caleb. You got a young one in that house. 11 months. Asa nodded and shelled the bean and dropped it in the pan, and the small wet sound of it was loud in the quiet. He asked whether the dog had gone strange, and Caleb said it had. He asked whether the frogs had quit, and Caleb said they had. And Asa nodded again, as though Caleb had confirmed a thing on a list, an old list, a list he had not looked at in a long time, and wished he did not still know by heart. When I was a boy, Asa said, we kept the stock up close to the house in the dark of certain falls, and nobody said why. And the why got handed down quieter than the doing of it. He set the pan aside. I've heard a sound twice in my life I won't try to tell you about, because telling it makes it smaller, and it is not small. If you've heard it, you know the one I mean. If you haven't, you will, and then you'll quit asking old men to explain it. He looked at Caleb a long moment to see whether he had heard it yet, and seemed to decide that he had not. Not yet. Then you keep her off the creek side, Asa said. And you don't go down there at night to prove anything to yourself. There's nothing down there worth proving. He went back to his beans, and that was all he would give, and the not giving was its own kind of testimony, and Caleb drove home with the windows up and the radio off and the photos heavy in his pocket like stones. The escalation, when it came on the third night. And it came to the house. He had moved the crib. He had told Risa it was because of a draft off the east wall, which was a lie, and she had let the lie land because she had her own reasons now. Because she had seen Boone and seen the porch and seen her husband not sleeping. The crib went to the interior wall, the one with no window, and the kitchen on the other side. And Caleb slept on the floor of the nursery, with the rifle and a flashlight, and the dog, who would only settle in the room where the baby was. At 2:13 by his phone, the dog came off the floor without a sound, and stood facing the east window with his hackles up and his weight forward and made no growl at all, which was worse than the growl, and Caleb came up off the floor with the flashlight and did not turn it on. The window was a black rectangle with the faint silver of the cut grass beyond it. He watched the rectangle. The peepers were gone, had been gone, since before he lay down, and into that silence came a sound he would spend the rest of his life failing to describe to anyone who had not heard it, a low sound, with a floor under the floor of it, a bass rumble running steady. Fast, dry, chattering vibration that did not match the rumble's rhythm. Two sounds from one source, the way two strings ring from one struck chord. Like two throats working in one chest. He felt it in the bones of his face before he fully heard it. It was not a sound an animal his mind had a drawer for could make. It did not come from the woods. It came from just past the glass, at the level of a standing man's chest from the dark 6 feet outside the window where the cut grass was, and it went on for the length of 3 breaths and stopped. Caleb did not move. Behind him, in the dark, Risa had come awake without a sound. He could hear the change in her breathing, the held quality of it, and he willed her to stay still, and she stayed still. He had hunted his whole life, and he knew the difference between a thing that is hunting and a thing that is looking, and this was looking. It was not startled by the dog. It was not driven by hunger. He could read. It held its place and made its sound and considered the window, and Caleb stood 8 feet inside the room with a baby asleep behind him, and understood with a cold clarity that had nothing to do with panic that he was not the hunter in this moment. Panic is loud. This was silent and absolute. He stood, and it stood, and the glass was the only thing between them. And then the weight outside shifted, felt it more than heard it, a settling and a release. The grass giving up a long breath as the weight came off it, and it was gone, and the peepers did not come back for an hour. In the morning, under the east window, the cut grass was pressed flat in a patch the size of a kitchen table, and in the soft ground at the bed's edge. Below the flattened grass, there were 2 prints, 11 inches, 4 points at the front spanning 4 1/4 inches. He measured them because measuring was what he had. He found 6 feet up the brick wall beside the window, 2 parallel scores in the soft mortar between courses, fresh, pale, 4 1/4 inches apart, and he stood under them and reached up and could not touch the lower of the 2 with his fingertips. He stood there a long while with his arm up and his fingers short of the mark, doing the arithmetic he did not want to do, the arithmetic of how tall a thing had to be to set those scores where they were. He called the wildlife officer that day and got a man named Petrie, who was decent and overworked, and who said it sounded like a bear. Had been at the house and that bears stood taller than people thought, and that he'd send a depredation form Caleb could fill out if there was livestock loss. Caleb said there was no livestock. He started to describe the print, the absence of a heel, the spacing, the height of the mortar scores, and he heard himself doing it, and heard how it landed in the silence on the other end of the line. And he stopped, because a man who has spent his life being believed, because he never overstates a thing, and he had reached it. Petrie said, kindly, that big bears could do surprising things, and that fear made tracks look bigger, and that without livestock loss there wasn't a lot the office could do. But to call back if it came around again and to secure his garbage. And Caleb thanked him and hung up and stood in the kitchen, with the form that wasn't coming, and understood that the system built to help him was a phone that rang in an office 2 counties over, and a man who said the word bear, because bear was a word the form had a box for. No one was coming. That was not cruelty. It was just the shape of the thing. He was alone up the grade with his wife and his daughter and his dog, and a rifle he no longer fully believed in, and the only question left was whether the thing past a glass would decide the window was worth the trouble. He stopped trying to make anyone believe him. He started preparing instead, the way he prepared for a flood or an ice storm, methodically, without drama. He ran a heavy bar across the inside of the nursery window. A length of seasoned oak he sized and set into steel brackets lagged into the studs, the kind of thing he'd build to hold a gate against a bull, and he tested it with his own weight, and it held. He moved the family to sleep in the interior hall, all 3 of them and the dog. Mattresses on the floor between 2 walls with no glass. He filled the truck with fuel and turned it nose out in the drive. He charged both flashlights and set them where his hand would find them in the dark. He cut the brush back another 40 feet on the creek side with the county brush saw, working in daylight with the dog tied where he could see him. And he found, doing it, more sign than he wanted, a place at the new tree line where the ground was packed, the way ground packs where a thing stands a long time and watches. Vantage with a clean sightline to the east window, and he understood that it had been coming for longer than 3 nights, that the bent rail had been the announcement of a thing already in residence, already mapping the house, already learning which window held the crib before he himself had moved the crib away from it. That was the detail that took the last of the rational ground out from under him, standing at the new tree line in the flat afternoon light. The thing had known where the baby slept. It had come to the east window the first night the crib was still against the east wall, and it had not come back to the east window after he moved the crib, and a bear does not revise its approach to account for furniture. He stood at the watching place, with the brush saw idling in his hands, and felt the cold animal's certainty settle into him, the pre-linguistic kind, the kind older than the word for it.